thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is sincerely grateful for the opportunity to invite Seattle audiences into present tense exchanges of issues, ideas, and creativity, even when we can't, do it in person. Town Hall will continue to produce online content throughout this fall and into the new year, and as circumstances allow, to even host live streams from our building. Meanwhile, if like me, you just can't log quite enough hours on Zoom or YouTube, know that many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form under the header Digital Media on our website. Back to tonight's program. Professors Kupchan and Mead will talk for about an hour, after which they'll take questions from the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. Please keep your questions concise and we'll get to as many as possible. Also, know that you can view the event both here on Crowdcast or over on our YouTube page if you want to utilize that platform's closed captioning feature. Just know that it's easier for us if you pose your questions back over here. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. And actually, there's another program tonight following this event with Peter Baker and Susan Glasser discussing the legacy of former Bush Chief of Staff James Baker, whom they describe as the man who ran Washington. But in the near future, I want to call your attention to a panel discussion moderated by Joni Balter, posing the question, has Seattle become ungovernable? A discussion of the politics of food with author Marion Nessel, a conversation on life, love, and responsibility with memoirist Roger Rosenblatt, as well as upcoming appearances by Mario Livio, Michael Eric Dyson, Robert Putnam, and Andre Gregory, and still more programs from the 2020 Earshot Jazz Festival offered live from our forum space. For more information about all of the above, visit townhallseattle.org. Our work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Civics programs in particular are supported by the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But finally, as most of you know, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight. For one final piece of infomercial, and yes, and I just used the word finally twice in successive sentences, but I mean it this time. It goes without saying that our partner booksellers are feeling the effects of the pandemic as well. And since we know you'll want to go deeper into the issues in tonight's discussion, especially in this pivotal moment in American and world political history, I hope you'll consider purchasing a copy of the book here tonight from our partners. Don't buy from the big multinational that used to specialize in books. Keep it local just this once. All right. Charles Kupchan is Professor of International Affairs in the School of Foreign Service and Government Department at Georgetown University and Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. From 2014 to 2017, Kupchan served in the Obama administration as Special Assistant to the President on the National Security Council. He also served on the National Security Council during the Clinton administration. He's been a visiting scholar at August universities, including Harvard, Columbia, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. And alongside his numerous articles on international and strategic affairs, he's the author of 9 previous books, including The End of the American Era from 2002, 2010's How Enemies Become Friends, and No One's World, The West, The Rising Rest, and the Coming Global Turn, published in 2012. Walter Russell Mead is the Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship at the Hudson Institute, the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and a professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College in New York. Before joining Hudson, Mead was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he has authored numerous books himself, including the widely recognized Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World from 2001. And next year, I hope we'll have the chance to host him in analog form, I guess I mean live, for a coming work entitled The Ark of a Covenant, the United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People. Charles Kupchan's 10th book, Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World, is the subject of the discussion tonight. Please join me in welcoming Walter Russell Mead and Charles Kupchan.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Ware. It's really terrific to be here and to be here with Charles, who I've known for, I hate to think how many years now, but I can
quite a while.
I can certainly remember back in the Clinton administration doing a PBS thing together on, I think it was Bosnia back then. So that's like 30 years ago. And you've written 10 books, which fills me with envy. I don't know how you do it so quickly, and they're good. So this book, number 10, on isolationism, what led you to this subject? And what do you find? I mean, it's a kind of a deep dive into history. What is the relevance of all of that history for what we're looking at today?
Thanks, Walter, for joining me tonight, and thanks to Ware and Town Hall Seattle for organizing this event. Maybe I'll answer that question, Walter, by discussing 3 revelations that occurred to me while I was working on the book. The first, and I think this will be music to your ears because I know you feel the same way, is that those of us who write about American foreign policy, who think about America's role in the world, don't know enough about what came before Pearl Harbor. And I put myself into that category in the sense that until I wrote this book, I knew a lot about World War II. I knew a lot about containment. I could tell you what happened after 9/11, but I could tell you very little about American policy in the early decades, in the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century. And it was eye-opening for me. In fact, my head exploded when I started to read this history, because my first reaction was, what country am I reading about? This story bears so little resemblance to the America that I know and that I have grown up in, because that America was very engaged in the world, sending military forces around the world, always at war. That's not what we were like for most of our history. The second revelation that I think I'll put out here at the front of our conversation is that one of the reasons we were isolationist and were reluctant to extend our strategic reach around the world was American exceptionalism. The founders propagated this notion that foreign ambition would come at the expense of liberty and prosperity at home. And so they said, instead, we should perfect the American experiment by keeping the world at bay and tending our own garden. That was also a revelation to me, because since World War II, American exceptionalism has been the opposite, namely a narrative that says America has to go out and run the world. That's new. That's really a post-World War II phenomenon. And then the final revelation, and this will come directly to your question about relevance for today, is that I started this book well before Trump was elected. But then when Trump came into office, and on his first day, right after his swearing in, he says, from this day forward, it's America first. It was like, whoa, this president is going back to the pre-Pearl Harbor narrative of America first, and the isolationism, the unilateralism, the protectionism, the nativism and racism that we see in Trump's approach to the world. That's not a bolt from the blue. It's right out of American history. And as you wrote in your own book, Special Providence, which definitely shaped my own thinking about this, he's tapping into a more populist, what you call a Jacksonian tradition that really was very powerful during much of American history and is still powerful today, as we're finding out during Trump's presidency.
Yeah, it's hard for people, isolationist is kind of a dirty word in American foreign policy. Actually, one of the interesting things about sort of the Cold War era and beyond is that there's a kind of a moralization of foreign policy ideas. If somebody says, well, maybe we should make a concession, you say you're an appeaser. That's Munich. If somebody says we need to worry about what are we outsourcing to China, you hear, well, it's a protectionist, and the moral case is free trade. So that a lot of the foreign policy arguments in the Cold War era and beyond really kind of came down to pinning nasty labels on the other person, because it was sort of assumed that there was a singular truth, the right way to do foreign policy, and then everything else was wrong. As you went back and compared that older tradition with what we are now, with that Cold War and post-Cold War thing, did you find that holding up? Did you find there was merit in the older tradition, or was it all kind of, is it all bad that it's coming back?
Yeah. Well, we tend to have had two different modes of strategy in this country, in the sense that from 1789, when we began life as a federation, until 1941, isolationism was basically the only game in town. And by isolationism, just to make clear what I'm saying, it's about the extension of strategic commitments outside the motherland, beyond North America. We were very engaged commercially from day one. We were engaged culturally from day one. We sent our military abroad on a short-term basis to defend our commercial interests and our citizens. But what we did not do is follow in the footsteps of great European powers and take over colonies, take over territorial possessions, extend our reach and into the affairs of other countries. That's what the founding fathers said we should not do when George Washington in the farewell address said, commercial relations with everyone, political connections with no one. And that basically lasted right up until 1941. It was the only game in town, right? Then after 41, as you were just saying, internationalism and running the world was the only game in town. And if you said, hey, why are we in Afghanistan? Why are we in Iraq? Everyone said, isolationist, bad, dark. And so one of the things I want to do in the book is leaven the national debate so that we can talk about the pros and cons of a more isolationist strategy. We can talk about the pros and cons of American internationalism and hopefully find a middle ground between doing too little, which is where we were in the 1930s, doing too much, which is where I think we've been amid our forever wars. And yes, when I look back at the history of the United States prior to World War II, I see a period during which the aversion to geopolitical detachment made great sense. The United States rose in the 19th century in unmolested fashion, in part because it focused on the home front, on Western expansion, on investment in the United States, not investment in battleships and colonies. Then, in the interwar period, isolationism went way too far, and it led the United States to run for cover when serious, unavoidable threats were emerging in Europe and Asia. So the goal here is to sort of look at the longue durée and to ask, when does strategic detachment make sense and when it be good for us? When is strategic detachment not make sense? And what does it tell us today when it comes to America moving forward?
I want to promise our audience we will move the conversation up into the present tense a little bit more as we go on, but I think it's important to kind of to look at the historical case that Charles is working with and some of these issues. I think one something that everyone can recite the name of, but very few people I think really understand, is the Monroe Doctrine and its role as sort of an element of an American grand strategy. How did you, as you were going through this, how did you come to think of the Monroe Doctrine and of its place in American thought? Before
I get to the Monroe Doctrine, which is the 1820s, let me just tell a very quick story from 1793, because I think it will convey to the listeners today just how tenacious this aversion to entanglement was, going right back to the beginning, right back to George Washington. Right? In the Revolutionary War, we were losing, right? The British were getting the best of us. And the founders, who were against alliance and against attaching ourselves to any foreign power, said, we need an alliance with the French, otherwise we're going to lose. And what happened? Well, we formed an alliance, the French came over, and they helped us win the Revolutionary War. A few years later, in 1793, Britain and France go to war again, and the French ask George Washington, how many troops, how many ships are you going to send across the Atlantic? What does George Washington do? He issues the Proclamation of Neutrality, in which he basically says to the French, despite the alliance, good night and good luck, you are on your own. And that was the last alliance the United States had until after World War II. So that's how tenacious, even for George Washington, this idea of detachment was. Then coming to the Monroe Doctrine, 1823, Monroe issues a declaration in which he says, no new European colonies in the Western Hemisphere. This is after many Spanish colonies had turned into republics, and the Americans were afraid that the Spanish might come back. Now, in the conventional wisdom, in the public mind, this was a great declaration of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. It was nothing of the sort. It was mostly hot air. Most of the rest of the 19th century, the United States didn't lift a finger to defend its hegemony, quote unquote, in the Western Hemisphere. And a couple of years later, in 1826, when an American delegation was invited to Panama just for a conference, a talk fest about the future of Republican government in Latin America, and the president, who at that time was John Quincy Adams, wanted to send a delegation, Congress went berserk. And they said, we have no business interfering in the affairs of Latin America. And anyway, we don't want to sit down at a table with people of African descent, with Latin Americans, with Catholics. That's not us. That's not our business. There was a strong racist reaction. Eventually, Congress approved the delegation, but it was so late that one of the delegates died before they got there, and the other one arrived so late that the Congress was over. So, so much for the Monroe Doctrine. So,
Washington, when he broke the treaty with France, did he just say, hey, I'm breaking the treaty? Did he have an excuse? How did he handle that? I mean, he wouldn't tell a lie to his dad about the cherry tree. How does he break an alliance with France?
Well, this was a hugely controversial issue, as you can imagine, in part because, as you know, there were different camps in the United States at this time, and the Jeffersonians that dominated in the southern part of the country were very pro-French. The Hamiltonians that dominated in the north were pro-British. And so when Washington said that we're not coming, we're going to remain neutral, the Jeffersonians went crazy. But Washington was very smart. He was very strategic. And he didn't say that we're reneging on the alliance or that we're annulling the alliance. He basically said, under the current circumstances, we don't think it's in the American national interest to involve ourselves in a war between Britain and France. Despite the fact that he was careful in not annulling it, the opposition still went crazy. They said, you don't have the constitutional authority not to honor that alliance, because alliances are ratified by the Senate and only the Senate can undo them. And in some respects, the farewell address of 1796 was Washington's effort to thread the needle, because he came back to this theme and he said, we really don't want entangling alliances with anybody. You know what? We'll honor those that we have, sort of, maybe once in a while, but let's not do this again. And so even though the alliance was basically defunct, it wasn't until 1801 that it was mutually pulled down by the French and the Americans in creating a new treaty.
Let's jump forward a bit. How did this isolationist empire, so to speak, the dominance of this isolationist current in American history, what made it go away? Why didn't we just go right back to being isolationist after World War II? What happened?
Well, we start off, particularly after the Civil War, finishing westward expansion. And it's important to put a caveat out there that even though the United States saw itself as the chosen nation that was following the path of enlightenment, that was anti-empire, that was anti-expansionist, it was pretty ruthless as it expanded westward. A lot of people died. Native Americans were pushed out of the way or put onto reservations. We grabbed a big chunk of land from Mexico. We tried unsuccessfully to take over Canada on multiple occasions. So it's not like the United States was sweetness and light throughout the 19th century, but it did adhere to the Founding Fathers' admonition to go no further than the Pacific coast, to tend to our own garden, not to look for trouble abroad. Or to put it in the words of John Quincy Adams, we go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. But you then get to the end of the 19th century. The United States has turned into a world-class economic power, in part because it was focused on domestic development. And the frontier closed, in the words of the historian Frederick Jackson Turner. And so Americans began to worry that the American experiment, the dynamism, the democracy, the prosperity could begin to wane. Industrialization was kicking in. And so a new narrative emerged that if this exceptional experiment is going to continue, we need a new frontier. Well, where is that new frontier now that we've made it to the Pacific coast? It's overseas. And that's the narrative that President McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, the Admiral Mahan used to justify the Spanish-American War, to basically say, we now need to take manifest destiny on the road because we've completed the mission here at home. The main problem, as you know, Walter, is that in making that argument and in kicking the Spanish out of Cuba, we also took over Cuba, took over Puerto Rico, annexed Hawaii, occupied the Philippines, took over Samoa and the Wake Islands and Midway. And suddenly Americans said, wait a minute, you told us that we were taking manifest destiny abroad to spread democracy in the American way, and suddenly we are colonial occupiers of the Philippines. And that then set the stage both for the Wilsonian correction to idealism, but also for the isolationism of the interwar era.
So how did Wilson's sort of reaction against this earlier Rooseveltian policy take shape in your view?
Well, I think that part of what happened here is that there was a sharp backlash against real imperialism. Americans aren't imperialists. It's not in our DNA. It's not in the Constitution. In fact, there were very interesting debates in the early 1900s about what do we do with these territories? What do we do with Puerto Rico? What do we do with Samoa? Right? Because they weren't on the path to statehood, in part because they were not occupied by white people. And this was a big part of the qualifications for integration into the Union. And so they really did struggle to figure out the status of these territories. And we're still dealing with that today, right? There are debates today about should Puerto Rico become a state of the Union. But anyway, you go through this movement away from empire. In fact, there was a so-called anti-imperialist movement that the Democratic candidate for president, a successive candidate, Williams Jennings Bryan, he ran on, right? And then Wilson, the Democrat, comes in. He picks up this theme, and he basically is an idealist / isolationist, who pulls out of European and Asian commitments. He maintains a strong interventionist stance in the Western Hemisphere, but he sees the United States as a country that is going to spread democracy around the world. And he basically disavows any realist ambition. And he then takes the country into World War I in 1917 after the Germans begin to sink American vessels. But he does so on the basis of pure idealism. When he goes before Congress in April 1917 to ask for a war declaration, He says, we're here to save the world for democracy. We're going to war simply on the matter of principle and human right. And suddenly Americans are dying in the trenches, and they're asking themselves, what is Wilson talking about? And then he tries to sell the League of Nations to the Senate. That doesn't work. 3 votes, all of them down. And so Wilson finally says, well, I couldn't convince the Senate, so I'm going to convince the American people. And he says the election of 1920 is a referendum on American internationalism. And the opponent, the Republican candidate, Warren Harding, basically says, make my day. I stand for the policies of George Washington. I am against foreign entanglement. He was running against James Cox, the hand-picked Wilsonian. What happens? Warren Harding wins one of the most lopsided elections in American history. And that really clears the way for the stubborn isolationism of the 20s and the 30s.
I've say in some ways, it's always seemed to me that the 1930s were probably the most isolationist decade in American history. That, you know, at least in the 20s, they had the idea that, well, you know, the Federal Reserve should work with the Bank of England. There were the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan to get financial flows going in post-war Europe. You know, so there was a you know, it was inadequate. It was sort of hyper optimistic that simply by keeping the economies of the world going, we could keep. Oh, and naval disarmament. That was the other.
And Kellogg-Briand. Don't forget Kellogg-Briand.
Well, sometimes, you know, every now and then, Charles, I do ask myself, for some of the viewers, Kellogg-Briand was the wonderful 1929 treaty. Was it ratified?
28.
28. It was signed.
Right.
But it outlawed war, and really just in the nick of time. Can you imagine what history would have been like if war had not been outlawed in the late 1920s? I mean, you know, the murder, the mayhem that would have taken place. But yeah, it was, you know, I mean, they weren't complete idiots, the isolationists of the 20s, because for one thing, you know, the idea of self-determination, breaking up the European empires. Hey, it's a wonderful humanitarian thing. Let people govern themselves. On the other hand, if you divide Europe up into lots of little countries and 2 of them have a quarrel, it's not going to be like the quarrel between Austria, you know, not dragging in a big empire that could drag in America. So they had some thought. And then naval forces at the time were the only ones that could get to the United States. So the US pushed naval disarmament very hard. And so they had this sense, okay, we've prevented the worst, we've broken up the big empires, we've gotten rid of the absolute monarchies, we've got naval disarmament, and we're going to keep the economy going. So in the 20s, there was this kind of, call it internationalism light in a way. No institution building, no formal alliances, but, you know, but then in the 30s, when the Depression hits and Roosevelt says, you know, basically we cannot, we just have to look inward right now. So Roosevelt torpedoes the London Economic Conference, which was an attempt for an internationalist approach to the Depression. And so really up until, I would say, the fall of France in 1940, when people really begin to worry in the administration, we're just out of it for those 10 years. Does that sound right?
Yes, I think you're spot on in the sense that the 20s, the US practiced what I call in the book, borrowing a term from a historian named Christopher Nichols, isolationist internationalism, in the sense that the US was internationalist because it continued to be involved commercially. It continued to essentially conduct diplomacy through Wall Street. I mean, Wall Street was in Europe and in East Asia trying basically to run the world through investment and trade. The other thing that occurred in the 1920s is that there was a new multilateralism in naval arms control in Kellogg-Briand. But interestingly, these were all pacts of inaction. The United States was willing to make commitments as long as they were commitments to do nothing. That is to say, not to build a navy and to outlaw war. You would have never gotten the Senate to ratify something that committed the United States to do something. That doesn't happen until the 40s, until World War II. And then the Great Depression is really the turning point. And that's when the US not only detaches itself geopolitically, but also commercially. And Roosevelt says, you know, I'm going to be focused like a laser on the domestic front, and begins to shepherd through the Congress one neutrality act after another, which more or less cuts the United States off from the outside world, the belligerents in the outside world, to avoid the prospect of being drawn into the war. And, you know, this is another revelation that I came upon. Roosevelt is remembered for the New Deal, but also as this great wartime leader. But until Pearl Harbor, he really was part of the isolationist mainstream. Yes, he did change course in 1939 and began to argue that the US needed to provide assistance to the British and others that were the victims of Nazism and fascism. And then he started Lend-Lease in 1941. But his main objective was not to bring the US into the war. It was to prevent the US from going to war by letting others defend themselves and keeping the Nazis from becoming strong enough to come to the Western Hemisphere. And he did not go to war until he had no choice, because Japan brought the war to the US.
Yeah, well, that phrase of his arsenal of democracy, which somehow sounds internationalist to people somehow today, but was really, we want to supply them with all the weapons they need so that we can sit here safely and have that, you know, basically, I think Russian blood and British gold was more or less the way he hoped to be able to win the war. And even when we did get in, one notes that the Russians continued to take most of the casualties, and you know, Keynes has written that he thought that America had two wartime goals. One was to destroy the British Empire, and the other was to destroy Nazi Germany. And it was not clear to Keynes or many of the Brits at any given moment which objective was uppermost in the Americans' minds at any particular point.
Right. So and it's worth pointing out that even though Roosevelt was justifying giving aid to the victims of Nazi aggression, he nonetheless had to fight the America First Committee that founded in 1940, because they were against any assistance. They wanted tight, rigid, hemispheric isolation because they felt that it would be a slippery slope. If we started giving arms to the British, we'd end up at war. Yeah. And it also, you know, the public opinion in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, 80% of the American public was against entry into World War II. That just gives you a sense of how strong the isolationist sentiment was.
I mean, you know, you can sort of understand it. It's like, here's this wood chipper. Do you really want to stick your hand in the wood chipper?
Right.
And, you know, do you want your kid to go die on some island in the Pacific that you don't even know the name of? And people would naturally say no. I didn't really understand this part. I mean, I'd heard of it, but I hadn't really thought about it until I started doing my work on U.S.-Israel relations, which brought me into that post-war period and the whole Palestine thing. But I did not realize that actually after the end of World War II, Americans immediately reverted essentially to an isolationist approach, that we, you know, dismantled 90% of the army. Apparently one of the reasons that Roosevelt made as many concessions to Stalin as he did at Yalta was he believed that there was just no way he could keep American troops in Europe for more than a year after the end of the war. And it really, you know, it wasn't until Stalin sort of began to loom much larger that actually that post-war consensus really starts to take shape. It's Stalin after Hitler, not simply Hitler. Was that your reading?
Yeah, I mean, Roosevelt himself was worried that the internationalism wouldn't last, and that after the end of the war, the US would revert to its default position, which he took to be isolationism. And after the end of the war, as you know, there was a demobilization, even though the US did keep forces abroad, and even though there was bipartisan support for a new brand of what we now call liberal internationalism. The UN passed the Senate with very little objections. But you're right that over the course of the late 1940s and 1950s, the isolationists reappeared and dug in their heels. At first, they, the Cold War, the onset of the Cold War did push them to be more quiet. But then when that Cold War heats up and you get the Korean War, and then you get the decision to deploy 3 divisions to Europe in the early 1950s, people start to get worried. And you see various congressmen, Senator Taft, for example, and others say, hey, wait a minute, this is going too far. We don't want to go down this road. And in 52, 53, 54, there were various amendments that came forward to try to curtail the ability of the United States to deploy forces abroad and to take the kinds of actions that ended up being core to the Cold War.
Let's see, Charlie, can you maybe you should hit your refresh button. You frozen there.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Hi, this is Bruno from Town Hall. It's actually Walter is having a connection issue.
Okay.
All right, there we go. Charlie, you froze for a while, so I couldn't see you.
I think the Russians have stopped messing with our communication, so we can continue.
All right, good. Well, you see, I've been interested a bit in the way that if you look at some of the key documents of that period, like the UN Charter itself, as I read it, they actually incorporated Lodge's reservations into the UN Charter. That is, that if you look at the way the UN differs from the League of Nations, without saying anything about it, they quietly turned it from Wilson's League to Lodge's. And actually some of the weaknesses that are in the UN today, I think, you can trace them to that. But also, if you look carefully at the NATO treaty, it's fascinating. Historically, the nature of an alliance is what they call automaticity. That if countries A and B are allies and country C invades country B, then country A is legally obliged to go to country B's defense. But under the NATO treaty, actually, each country is obliged to consult its constitutional processes, because the Senate would not have ratified a NATO treaty that took the power to declare war out of the hands of the Senate, out of Congress's hands, but also, in a sense, so that even NATO is not quite what, say, Metternich or Talleyrand would have meant by an alliance.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify for everyone what you're talking about when you mentioned Lodge's reservations, when Wilson brought the Versailles Treaty, which contained the League of Nations, to the Senate, the Republican opponents, not all of them, but the internationalist wing of the party, led by Mr. Vandenberg, came to Wilson and said, listen, if you are willing to revise the treaty, to water it down a little bit so that it doesn't look like an international league can tell us what to do, then we'll go ahead and ratify it. And Wilson said, no, that would for me be a moral compromise, and I'd rather go down in flames than make a moral compromise. Well, that's exactly what happened. He went down in flames. And Roosevelt, you're right, Walter, learned from those mistakes. And he made sure that the document that emerged to put the UN forward was one that could pass the Senate. He made sure that there were always Republicans involved in working on the UN. He was very, very conscious of the need to keep the bipartisan aspects of foreign policy going. And the way that was drafted, the way that NATO was drafted, there was no automaticity. And this goes back to this long strain of isolationism and unilateralism. In many respects, the unilateralism more than the isolationism. And we see it today, big time, in the Republican Party and President Trump, this idea that no commitments that we make abroad can impair our sovereignty and the ability of our Congress and our executive branch to make their own decisions.
Right. Yeah, I actually in the column I've got that's coming out in the Journal tonight and tomorrow, I talk about how the modern Republican Party post-Trump is sort of what you've got left are two factions. One of the sort of Rand Paulite, I think, isolationists. They're probably 20s isolationists, in that they would favor business engagement and so on,
and nothing more.
Right, and then this the sort of Tom Cotton unilateral hawks who want an assertive American power, but would like to, and don't mind having associated allies, but don't want to see America compromise, and wanted to keep, and that so you now have these two wings. I think between them are pretty much the bulk of the Republican Party today.
I think it's very reminiscent of the 20s, because there at that point you had a bloc that was called the Irreconcilables, and they were basically the nativist libertarians, the nationalists, and then you had an internationalist wing of the Republican Party, but it was a unilateralist internationalism.
Yeah.
And today we see more or less the same thing, and the Democratic Party, meanwhile, has gone in the direction of the earlier Democratic Party and become very much more committed to multilateralism and international teamwork.
Well, it's a little more complicated, because you had Bora in the 20s, who was a progressive, but he was an irreconcilable.
Right.
And I would think today, somebody like a Bernie Sanders or some of these other figures on the Democratic left are much more cautious about, really do want a much more restrained foreign policy. So it looks to me as if, and it is, by the way, interesting if you think about the vote in 2016 and 2020, if you combine the Sanders vote and the Trump vote, you get a majority, who are supporting essentially candidates who fundamentally dissent from the kind of internationalist orthodoxy that you and I grew up with.
Right. History is rhyming, if not repeating, in the sense that you are seeing this strange alliance between progressives on the left and a kind of libertarian wing on the right that are calling for a pullback and for a different kind of foreign policy. In fact, we recently saw George Soros, right, a progressive, team up with Charles Koch, a right-wing libertarian, to found a new think tank, the Quincy Institute. And what brings them together is a desire to kind of demilitarize or to lower the militarization of American foreign policy and stay out of foreign wars. This is very similar to the alliance that Woodrow Wilson confronted between Emily Balch and other progressive activists on the left and people like Bora that you just mentioned on the libertarian nationalist right.
So it's funny how national character, I don't know if that's even the word for it, but how enduring some of these cultural features are. You see, we've got a question from the audience, and Charlie and I have had a great conversation. I think we would be happy to spend the next 3 hours going down various historical blind alleys together. But let's see what some of the audience has. And if anybody else would like to ask a question, you can use the ask a question feature. Click on that, and it should allow you to put a question in. So we have from Candace here, said, I just finished reading The Plot Against America by Philip Roth. that plays out what might have happened had we stuck to isolationism during World War II. And one thing that it seemed to lead to was an exposure of our worst notions of racism. Is racism more easily tapped into under an isolationist foreign policy?
Excellent question. Historically, racism, nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and isolationism have been entangled. They need not be entangled, in the sense that the United States could pursue a strategy in which it tries not to entangle itself in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places in a way that has nothing to do with racism. But in the 19th century, as I mentioned earlier, part of the brake on expansion was discomfort with bringing into the Union or attaching to the United States lands that were not populated by whites. You then get anti-immigrant sentiment kicking in the 1880s, first against Chinese, then against all Asians. Then in the interwar period, when, as Walter and I were just discussing, isolationism comes back with a vengeance, the US passes draconian anti-immigrant legislation. 1924 legislation essentially took down incoming immigration of Jews and Catholics from Europe by 90%. In the 1930s, about 1 million Americans of Mexican heritage were deported. So yes, there has been a general correlation. When the country is more isolationist, it also tends to either be anti-immigrant or more racially sensitive. And it's happening today. If you kind of peel back the onion on Trump's America First policy, you see the isolationism and the unilateralism that we've been talking about, hearkening back to earlier periods in American history, and it is being intertwined with and conflated with anti-immigrant and identity politics. It works, the two often go together, but logically speaking, there's no reason that they need to.
There actually were times, a lot of what was driving the imperialist movement was in fact a racism. The idea that the Philippines simply could not govern themselves, and that if once Spain was gone, if we left, they would fall into chaos and then be taken over by either Germany or Japan, was actually a motive force that influenced some of the policymakers there. So there was I think I would say you go back at certain points in history and you find that just about everybody's thinking is influenced one way or another by racial stereotypes or ideas of how history works that are in some ways racially inflected. So that, Teddy Roosevelt and William Jennings Bryan, both in their own way, one the leader of the imperialist camp, one the leading anti-imperialist, both actually we can see, had a lot of racial influence in their thinking.
I think that's exactly right. And the anti-imperialist movement basically said that, the people in the Philippines or the people in Cuba, they're never going to be able to govern themselves democratically because they're the wrong race or they're the wrong religion or they're the wrong culture. So let's not bother.
Yeah.
And then the imperialists said, well, you're actually right. They don't have the tradition, but that's why we have to go out and show them how to do it.
Yeah.
So they were both racist in their own way, but one camp was saying, hey, that's not our problem, stay away. The other camp was saying, we need to go out and save them and Christianize them.
Yeah.
And that was really the narrative that in some ways caught on after World War II. Not so much in we need to go out and Christianize and save them and make everybody, a certain race, but this idea that the American experiment could be universalized, that we could really go out there and spread the gospel.
It's interesting that a lot of the skepticism, even as late as the Vietnam War, somebody like William Fulbright, he was from Arkansas, And for someone of his generation, he grew up among people for whom Reconstruction was still very much a living reality. And a lot of his dovishness in Vietnam was linked to his skepticism that Asiatics could become Democrats. And so he saw Johnson's attempts to, have a TVA in the Mekong Delta, New Deal for South Vietnam, nation building. Fulbright, this sounded like the kind of Reconstruction hubris, and it just wasn't going to work. And I think one of the interesting patterns I noticed in American history was that when the Iraq War comes at a time when the South has sort of forgotten Reconstruction, or its own, the white South has forgotten what it felt like to them to be part of a northern nation building exercise.
Right. Well, yeah, you're right, Walter, in the sense that really until the 20th century, most American policymakers were very skeptical that you could go abroad and re-engineer a society.
Yeah.
Right. So when they had the big debates, let's say in the 1820s about revolutions in Latin America, or in the 1840s about revolutions that were sweeping Europe, there was a debate. Should we go out and help them? Should we intervene? Should we give money? And they always said no, because it's not going to work. And it really isn't until you get to the 20th century, and in particular to the Cold War era and after World War II, that Americans begin to think that they can actually go out and rebuild societies. And it worked in Germany and Japan.
Right.
It hasn't worked in many other places. And I think one of the reasons that Americans today are so frustrated with American foreign policy is that it didn't really work to try to turn Afghanistan and Iraq into Ohio. It's a fool's errand.
Well, it turns out, step one is you have to subject them to the greatest levels of violence that anyone has ever experienced with Japan and Germany in World War II. Step two, occupy them, have them surrender totally. And then step three, have another power that they hate even more than they hate you. And if you can combine those three ingredients, I do think it's a little troubling to me that that modern social science, the science of development, economics, and so on, a lot of its intellectual energy comes from developing a methodology for exporting the American way into other countries. And it is, one can see how people from another cultural background might look at that as a form of imperialism. I don't think we in America have thought about this enough, even though I would say there's still some merit in a lot of the things that we've done. Let me see. I think we've got another question here from the audience, from Mary on YouTube. Hello, Mary. With the hardship that COVID is inflicting on all countries, do you foresee a lot of countries taking a more isolationist look to regroup and rebuild? What are some of the risks in everyone taking that approach?
Well, Mary, it's this in some ways will allow me to talk a little bit about some of the lessons of history that Walter and I have been talking about for where we are today. Because I'm not someone who is an isolationist or who counsels isolationism. Far from it. I think the United States should stay engaged in the world and should continue to play an important role in keeping the peace in Europe and in East Asia, especially given the rise of China. But I do think that the country today faces conditions that are not unlike those in the 1930s. COVID-19, the pandemic, and its economic impact being chief among them. I mean, we are going through an economic crisis of a sort that we haven't seen since the 1930s. Americans are tired of the wars. We sense overstretch, just as we did after World War I. There is a sense that our ambition abroad has come at the expense of liberty at home, either because Big Brother has overreached on surveillance, or because we keep going to war based on pieces of legislation from 2001 and 2002. That's not what the founders intended, right? The founders gave to Congress the right to declare war for a good reason. They're not exercising that right. So I think given these conditions, the next president needs to focus heavily on the domestic front, taming the pandemic, getting our economy open, dealing with racial injustice, dealing with the fact that we are a deeply divided country and that our democratic institutions are stumbling. That doesn't mean that we can't continue to engage abroad, but it needs to be a more modest form of engagement. We need to find the middle ground between doing too much, which is where we've been for the last couple of decades, and doing too little, which is where we were in the 1920s and the 1930s. So what I call for in the book is a right sizing of American foreign policy that brings our ambition abroad back into line with our political will. That's the conversation that I think we need in this country. And I think that my guess is it's going to start coming because we have no choice. And I do worry that if we don't have that discussion, if we don't get ahead of the curve and craft this more modest and more pragmatic foreign policy by design, it could happen by default. And if that happens, then I think dangerous overreach could turn into even more dangerous underreach, just as it did in the 30s.
Let me throw you a curveball here on exactly that. If we look at what's going on in Azerbaijan and Armenia right now, we see a very dangerous shooting war breaking out, and it's not impossible that Azerbaijan is going to really start winning and start occupying territory that the Armenians in some cases have lived in for centuries, in some cases occupied after the more recent war between them. When that happens, there would certainly be pretty massive flight of hundreds of thousands of refugees in the winter in the mountains. Is that the kind of thing where, under your vision of American engagement, do we get into that, or do we stay out of that? Or is there, what do we do with a problem like this? Because, again, with the Armenians, you have the early genocide. There's a lot of history there. There will certainly be a powerful lobby in the U.S. that will want us to do something.
Yeah.
How would you, and this is kind of in your area of expertise, of policy expertise.
Yeah. Well, when I talk about lightening the load and easing off on the gas, I'm speaking specifically about military engagement, in the sense that our wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya have not gone well, and they have sapped the public's appetite for continued engagement of that sort. I do think that if we do pull back on those kinds of commitments, we have to lean in on diplomacy and lean in on multilateral
engagement. Let's suppose that it doesn't work, because I think there will certainly be cases when it just doesn't. And you come down to the binary choice, in a way, what Clinton faced in Kosovo. Right. Either you do nothing and see hundreds of thousands of refugees, or you risk war.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the bottom line is that the United States cannot do everything. And that I would want the U.S. to be very heavily involved in this conflict, leaning on Azerbaijan, leaning in Armenia to resolve the conflict peacefully. If there is an outflow of refugees, I would want the United States to be heavily involved in humanitarian assistance. I would not advocate for U.S. involvement in a war in that part of the world. And that's because I think that one of the mistakes that we have made in the recent past is repeated involvement in wars of choice in the strategic periphery. In some cases, we've done so for a good reason, right? Getting involved in some areas like Libya, we were intending, right, to save lives, to protect civilians. But what happened? Well, we intervened along with our European allies, and the country fell apart and turned into a magnet for terrorism. And so I think that, yes, there are times in which the US should use military force, but realize that it has knock-on effects that you can't control. So I'm big on keeping the US militarily engaged on the big ticket items, keeping great power peace in Eurasia. I am more skeptical that the US should send its sons and daughters into places like Syria or Nagorno-Karabakh. And that's why I think it's so important to get ahead of the issue on the diplomatic front. And one final issue, Walter, I think we're going to have to look to others to do more. You know, if there is a party that would deploy a peacekeeping force or should be doing something there, it's the Europeans, right? Europe has a big market. They should develop more capability and should become more capable of helping the United States in issues that require military force.
Now you're sounding almost Trumpy.
I wouldn't go that far. But I would remind everyone that it was under the Obama administration when, you know, when the president said, hey, you guys need to spend 2% of your GDP on defense. You guys need to pick up more of the heavy lifting. This is the direction in which American foreign policy is headed, whether our next president is Donald Trump or Joe Biden.
I think that's right. You got a couple more questions here from audience members, so let's go through them. This one is from Michael McLeod. Was Woodrow Wilson not striving by bringing America into World War I to lead and shape the world after the war in ways that would enable white men to keep running the world? Was World War I a sort of a policy aimed at cementing a racial/gender hegemony?
Well, Michael, your question exposes what a complicated guy Woodrow Wilson was, in the sense that he was in many respects the most idealist president in American history. He really did believe that the US could go out there and transform the world, and that we could create a global landscape in which nations played by a new set of rules. Open diplomacy, disarmament, banding together against aggression. But he was also, number one, an imperialist. He was perhaps the most interventionist president in the Western Hemisphere, not outside the Western Hemisphere, but in Latin America. And he was a racist who was in favor of segregating the civil service. And then when the war came to an end and the Versailles Treaty was being negotiated, he basically turned down a bid by the Japanese to include a clause on racial equality, which drove not just the Japanese, but the Indians and many others nuts, because they saw this as a treaty that was in some ways doing exactly what you said, which was ratifying racial hierarchy in the world. So yes, there was this complicated dual nature to Woodrow Wilson, but I think he needs to be remembered in both respects. An idealist leader who tried to change the world in positive ways, but someone who at the same time was a racist and an imperialist.
That's it's kind of how history works. It's a very complicated business. Let's see. How does U.S. involvement with Vietnam, the Vietnam War era, not today, fit into your analysis? In your opinion, has the U.S. learned from that experience?
Well, I think the Vietnam War was an instance of overreach. In general, I think pretty highly of American foreign policy during the Cold War, in the sense that we prevailed in that conflict because of patience, because of strategic patience. We generally played it pretty well, and we outlasted and outperformed the Soviet Union. The real concern that I have is what we've done since the fall of the Berlin Wall, when I think the sense of expanding the liberal order, turning the Middle East into an island of democracy, this is when we really got ahead of ourselves. But clearly in the Vietnam War, the United States engaged in a level of military intervention that was far beyond what the interests warranted. And it led to not an isolationist retreat, because that didn't really happen, but it did lead to a retrenchment where Nixon and Kissinger pulled back. They pursued Vietnamization. Nixon introduced in the Persian Gulf a strategy of relying much more heavily on Iran and Saudi Arabia to do America's bidding. So there was a trimming of commitments during that period, but there wasn't a collapse of the internationalist consensus, in part because the Cold War was still on, even though there was détente in some ways as a consequence of the Vietnam War. Have we learned the lessons? I fear not, because I think some of the mistakes that we made in Vietnam, we have recently made in the Middle East. That is to say, as Walter and I were talking about a little while ago, going into very complicated countries that we don't understand and don't know much about, and thinking that we can rebuild them from the inside out. It rarely works.
Yeah, it's surprisingly hard to learn some lessons. I mean, one of the things that struck me as one of history's little ironies was that Obama decision that you mentioned earlier about going into Libya, where in a sense, in sort of the whole basis of Obama's original political appeal was what a terrible mistake it was to go into Iraq, and how you can't predict the consequences, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we're now watching the Libyan civil war multiple years after the humanitarian intervention, which had great intentions, but which repeated a lot of the Iraq war false assumptions about what could be accomplished, I think.
I have to say, I mean, I was not working in the White House when that conflict broke out, but I have to say I was surprised, because I understood President Obama to be someone who did believe that the United States had bitten off too much, and who really did want to pivot out of the Middle East. As an outside observer at the time, I looked at Libya, which is a country that has about 140 tribes, and I said to myself, anybody who wants to invade that country should think again.
Yeah.
And my own sense of this, and this is completely impressionistic, because as I said, I wasn't there at the time, is he got kind of dragged into it by the Allies, because the Europeans really wanted to do it. There was support from Arab countries. And I think the sense was, well, listen, if all of these other countries want to do it, I don't want to be the one who stands in the way. But as we now know, the results of that intervention were not much better than the results of Iraq or Afghanistan.
Yeah. So it's harder to learn from history than it looks, I think is one lesson there. We have a question. How do we get Congress to exercise or to debate its war powers authority? I think is a smart question, because there has been a kind of a congressional abdication of power.
It's a tough question to answer, in the sense that I would have thought that it would have happened by now, right? It's now 2020. We've been fighting wars in the Middle East continuously since 9/11, and Congress continues to go along for the ride. I guess that my general answer would be this. I come away from the Trump era thinking that our system of checks and balances doesn't work as well as we thought it did. I'm not a big fan of President Trump, even though Walter accused me of sounding Trump-like. I'm not going to let that go lightly, Walter. I've actually been quite struck by the degree to which he can do an enormous amount of damage, and there's not much we can do about it, despite the fact that the founders built what they called a compound republic and dispersed power across the executive and the judicial and the legislative branches precisely to check everybody's power. Well, I haven't checked his power that well. So I do think that whatever happens in the election next week, we really ought to get together, whether on Capitol Hill or a wise person's Congress, and simply say, do we need to implement some kind of change, whether it be legislative or constitutional or legal, to make sure that we are not again experiencing the excesses of this recent era. And I do think that one of the issues that should be on the docket is reinstating Congress's role as the exclusive body that has the right to declare war and to make sure it exercises that right.
I think there were so many legislative permissions and various emergency acts, that Trump was able to basically, he can slap a tariff on any product he wants if he says it's a national security issue. And he has statutory authority to do it. There ought to be some kind of a sunset clause or some sort, but Congress has basically written an awful lot of blank checks over the last 50 or 60 years. And it would be awfully nice to see a bipartisan committee come together and think about which ones of those need to be repealed, and maybe any new grant of authority should have a sunset clause. All kinds of Congress actually, if it wanted to, could claw an awful lot of power back, but it just doesn't seem to want to.
And I have to say that in this current environment, where Democrats and Republicans rarely even speak to each other on Capitol Hill, it may well be hard to reach a consensus. But I think, Walter, you and I agree that the last 4 years have illuminated some problems in the system that do need to be addressed.
I think we've, I think the executive is overmighty. And that's another recurring theme, though, in American politics, is from time to time people do dial back an overmighty executive.
Well, this has been building for quite a while. I mean, it started in 1898. A lot of this does have to do with foreign ambition and foreign policy. The founders were right. That's what led to executive overreach. And then when you get to the Cold War era, and President Truman enters the Korean War without even bothering to go to Congress, right? I mean, the founders would roll over in their graves if they knew the United States entered that war with no resolution.
Right. But it's a little tricky because you have, with the Soviet Union with nuclear deterrence, the president doesn't have time to make phone calls before you decide whether to respond to an incoming missile strike. And so once the president of the United States, in a sense, has the power to destroy hundreds of millions of people by using the nuclear football, it can't help but infect the sort of political system in various ways. People see that that power in a different way. But I think, look, Charlie's book, which I highly recommend to everybody, I think will help you think more clearly about not just foreign policy, but as you can see from our discussion, foreign policy and domestic politics and policy are intimately connected. So I think we've probably stressed our audience long enough, kept everyone on Zoom equivalent long enough, but it's been a great talk, and I am so glad that you've written this book.
Walter, I can't thank you enough for joining me for this conversation. I also do need to blame you in part for this book because, as I said, a special providence was a book that influenced me and encouraged me to kind of take on this effort to look back at the nation's history. And I think you and I agree. Americans of all political persuasions need to know more about the country's past, particularly the pre-Cold War, pre-World War II past, as we try to figure out where we go in the future.
Absolutely. Great.
Yeah, and I just wanted to come back on and thank you both so much for tonight's talk. It's been fascinating. It's really good to have this different lens to look through at our current events. So thank you so much for your research, Charles, and Walter, thank you also for moderating this talk. And I want to thank all the audience for watching tonight as well. As Walter said, please buy the book. Please buy the book through the Buy the Book button or link that you have on your screen, and that'll take you right over to Third Place Books where you can support them. And if you'd like to watch more Town Hall content, you can follow this Crowdcast channel by clicking the follow button at the top right corner. We will hopefully see you both again sometime soon, but thank you again so much for being here tonight, and I hope you have a great night.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again.
All right.